Good evening. Tonight we look at a question in need of an urgent answer. How safe are pesticides and herbicides? And because it's urgent, we've set aside our promised report on conveyancing until next week. No one would deny that these powerful chemical agents have revolutionised agriculture and made our daily lives more comfortable. But in embracing their benefits and convenience, have we appreciated their full toxic potential and properly policed their production, their sale, their use and their disposal? The answer to that might be no. Recently in New South Wales there was something close to panic at the discovery that a lethal herbicide byproduct, dioxin, had been dumped on public rubbish tips. And earlier this year the Yarram incident raised the possibility of a link between heavy spraying and an unusually high rate of birth defects in a little country town in Victoria. In both cases, inquiries are underway. Meantime, we continue to use pesticides and herbicides, even ones under suspicion. What checks are there? What checks should there be to remove fears or to examine other suspicious evidence? Andrew Ollie reports.
One of the least common causes of infant mortality is a little-known disorder called Potter's syndrome. Potter's babies effectively are born without kidneys. The organ's development is suppressed at a crucial stage in the first few weeks of pregnancy. The malfunction is invariably fatal. The victims may be supported by their mothers while in the womb, but they cannot survive once the umbilicus is cut. Potter's syndrome is extremely rare. A city the size of Adelaide would expect perhaps 5 cases in a decade. But a few years ago, Adelaide had 5 cases in about as many weeks. No one could explain why. In fact, very few people, even today, are aware that it happened. One man who did notice was Dr. George Gibson. After a lifetime practicing obstetrics and gynecology, Dr. Gibson now applies his long experience to research. The dramatic upsurge in Potter's syndrome demanded investigation.
This originated in 1974-75, round about the Christmas period. We had an unusual incidence of 5 cases of Potter's syndrome in Adelaide that we knew about. This is considerably more than you'd expect. So we looked at these very carefully, and we were able to get a lot of good detailed information because the people concerned were here. And of the factors coming into this, the apparent most common one was exposure to pesticides at a very early stage in the pregnancy. From that, we thought, well, we'll have to look into this and determine whether it is something that really required close, meticulous investigation. So we mounted a small pilot study using a few rats, and we exposed them to 3 pesticides, one of which produced highly significant results.
At this stage, Dr. Gibson is unwilling to name the pesticide under suspicion because he wants to be absolutely certain before going public. Unfortunately, he's having trouble getting financial backing for more conclusive experiments. A few miles away in the same city, another researcher, unaware of Dr. Gibson's work, is also testing pesticides for possible harmful effects, also with difficulty. Dr. John Coulter says the work he's doing is frankly unpopular. Medical foundations such as the one he works for must rely on grants, and understandably some people are sensitive about his findings on pesticides.
2 which we bought in Adelaide last week, and this compound here contains a substance called dichlorvos, and this was shown to be mutagenic in bacteria right back in 1972. We've confirmed these tests recently. This one here was shown to be mutagenic, I think, in 1975 in bacteria, and again we've confirmed these tests recently in bacteria.
Well, it's one thing to be able to establish mutation effects in bacteria, but does that necessarily suggest that they'll be harmful to humans?
Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will be. What it means is that there's perhaps a 90% chance that because these substances are mutagenic in bacteria, they will indeed cause cancer in humans.
The third one was the one of which I was least suspicious, and that produced quite a number of highly significant abnormalities.
Were you surprised at that result?
I was very surprised because I thought that this one wouldn't be likely to produce anything, frankly, because it is in quite common use.
Most of us make the same assumption as Dr. Gibson. If a pesticide is widely used, then it's obviously safe. The truth is somewhat less comforting. Even the most commonly applied products can be virtually unknown quantities.
At the present time, we have about 250,000 completely new, novel organic chemicals synthesised every year, and about 500 to 1,000 of these find their way into the marketplace. Now, at the moment, the majority of these are not tested for their ability to cause cancer or their ability to mutate. The exceptions to this, of course, are the materials which are intended specifically for human use, things like drugs and food additives. But the vast range of things like these pesticides, by and large, the presumption is that they don't get into human beings and that therefore there is no need to test them.
Australians are exposed, for the most part willingly, to a bewildering array of pesticides, from the humble flea collar to devastating wonder chemicals which have transformed agriculture. The industry's annual turnover in this country is around $140 million. Mr. Brett, your industry produces a whole range of very toxic substances. How accountable do you think it should be?
Well, Mr. Ollie, the basis on which our industry must work is care, caution and concern. If we don't work on that basis, we don't remain credible, and as soon as we lose our credibility, we're done in the marketplace, we're done with government, we're done with the media.
Could I ask you that question again, though? How accountable do you think you should be?
Mr. Ollie, we are accountable.
Every pesticide must satisfy a host of government committees before it's released into the marketplace. Many of the chemicals are imported and have already undergone similarly exhaustive trials in the country of origin before reaching our shores. But yet, a doubt must exist, a very grave doubt, that even all that testing is enough. In the space of 9 months, between December 1976 and August last year, 2 pesticides in relatively common use in Australia were suddenly withdrawn from sale because they were extremely hazardous to human health. The first was Leptophos, an orchard spray sold under the brand name Fosvel. The second was a soil fumigant, dibromochloropropane, DBCP.
The two you mentioned, I'm familiar with them, but I can recall what actually went into the decisions about that, but I'd prefer not to talk about those two at the moment, if you don't mind.
Dr. E.J. Fitzsimons chairs the 2 subcommittees responsible for screening pesticides, like Leptophos and DBCP.
The point with DBCP is that it was only withdrawn after there were human casualties in 1977. Yet there'd been similar casualties, sterility amongst laboratory animals in 1961. Laboratory animal tests had also shown that it could cause cancer in 1973, and in 1976 it had been shown to be mutagenic in laboratory animals. Do we have to wait for human casualties before we withdraw or hold back a product?
I can't see an alternative, though, can you? I mean, to say if a thing is used, we have to sort of keep it under a review, and if untoward effects turn up eventually, I think we have to take action.
But what about those untoward effects that had already shown up with laboratory tests on animals? Were they ignored or not known about, or what?
I couldn't really answer that one.
But where do you get your information from when you're assessing that sort of thing? I mean, if you knew that it had caused that sort of problems in laboratory tests, would you be cautious about it?
Oh, yes.
Did you know about it?
In this particular one, at the time, probably they didn't.
Well, the tests were done long before. I mean, the tests have been available for years. Are you not keeping abreast of those?
Oh, certainly we are, yes. Certainly we're keeping abreast.
Well, then why wasn't it withdrawn before?
I couldn't tell you that. I couldn't answer that one, rather.
I take it you support their action in withdrawing that product?
Well, we thought it was very responsible, and...
What would you have done if they hadn't withdrawn it? Would you have withdrawn it?
We would certainly have asked them for evidence to refute the claims, or for further evidence anyway.
Mr. Brett, when a company has to withdraw a product that it has on the market, it obviously represents a huge loss on investment, all the money that's been spent in developing and refining that product. Because of that, do you think it's likely that there'd be a temptation, if you like, to hang on as long as possible in the market?
Mr. Ollie, I completely reject that suggestion. The record stands for itself. In the last few years, there have been at least 5 products withdrawn from the market voluntarily by the companies owning them, and the company, and this included DBCP, the companies advised the authorities that they were withdrawing these products because of some unanswered questions.
I'm well aware of that, but at the same time, some of those unanswered questions were unanswered 15 years beforehand or more.
Mr. Ollie, I reject that suggestion. The information that was available to Dow in the early 1960s was also available to the authorities, and every person who evaluated it, both government and industry, considered it of no consequence at that time, and it has still not been proven that it is of consequence.
So it simply seems that they were wrong.
Nobody's saying that they are wrong. What I am saying is that the information is still being evaluated, and that on the results of that evaluation will depend the future of the product, although I understand that both Dow and Shell will not be continuing with production of DBCP because the tolerance levels for continuing occupational exposure will make it uneconomic to continue to produce the product. And I may add that the primary producer will lose a very valuable aid to production.
You say it's very responsible for the company to withdraw, and I'm sure no one would doubt that sentiment, but the government vests in you the watchdog powers over these sort of things rather than the companies who may well have vested interests. Shouldn't it in fact be you people who are withdrawing these sort of things, who are moving first?
Yes, I quite agree. All I can say is that we keep up a continuing review of the literature, and we do expect the manufacturers, if anything untoward comes to notice, to inform us. And I think they act very responsibly.
Such faith is not altogether well-founded. The pesticide companies may spend millions of dollars developing and refining a single product. Most of that work is done by their multinational parents overseas. In Australia, the chemicals are simply formulated into products tailored to local requirements. Critics of the industry claim that it consciously looks for chemicals with wide-ranging effects. The more selective the product, the more limited the market. Obviously, a company's first interest is the efficiency of its products. What happens when a company manages to develop a wonder chemical with huge potential, but with the merest hint of undesirable side effects? There must be a temptation to dismiss the counterindications. And there's another worry. Consider the case of Hooker's Chemicals and Plastics in the United States. That company recently advised the US Environmental Protection Agency that it planned to voluntarily withdraw a pesticide which had been found to cause tumours and reproductive problems in laboratory animals. However, the company also advised that it planned to continue exporting the same product.
Do you see the dilemma, though, of trying to rely on the information provided by overseas manufacturers if they're quite happy to export a product from the United States, for example, that they don't consider safe enough themselves to be sold in America?
Yes, I suppose there is a dilemma there.
What sort of protection do we have in Australia against that?
You can say that we keep an eye on the literature, and also I think we have established very good relations with industry, so that we do expect to be informed.
But there's no guarantee that industry itself is informed. The makers of DBCP, Dow Chemicals, told Four Corners that while the parent company in America might be familiar with results of tests on its products, that information might not be made known to Dow Australia. Neither Dow nor Shell, which formulated and marketed DBCP in Australia, would be interviewed. Shell didn't even want to know the topic. There was a similar response from the companies involved with Leptophos, the orchard spray marketed in Australia as Fosvel until late 1976. Fosvel was manufactured in the United States, but only for export. it was never approved for use in America. As with DBCP, there were indications that Fosvel was hazardous long before it was withdrawn from sale. The pesticide is capable of producing severe neurological disorders, including permanent paralysis. Yet when it was finally withdrawn, it seems there wasn't one word of explanation or warning. Fosvel was imported by Velsicol Australia from its parent company and distributed in this country by ICI. Both companies declined interviews. ICI issued a brief statement. Velsicol said any questions would have to be forwarded in writing to the American head office. Neither company could recall advising those people who had supported them by buying Fosvel of the dangers to which they had been exposed.
Well, did you tell them?
We didn't tell them, as far as I know.
Do you think you have a duty to advise them in that situation?
May I say this, though, that we're getting into an area of occupational health now, and this does not really come within our province.
But you had approved this chemical, leptothos, to be used in this country. Suddenly the manufacturer withdraws it. Don't you think the people who've been exposed to the dangers that the company itself foresaw should be advised that they've been exposed to those dangers? And don't you think you have the job to do that?
I think it would be reasonable for them to be advised.
Well, why didn't you advise them?
I don't think we did advise them. I'm pretty sure we didn't anyway. But we noted the evidence at the time.
The experience with Fosvel and DBCP is clear evidence that dangerous pesticides can and do get onto the Australian market. It's also clear that the authorities are not always equipped or perhaps willing to move against them. In New South Wales, for example, it can take up to a year to withdraw registration of a pesticide. It's against that background that the debate now raging over another chemical still used in this country must be seen. That chemical is 2,4,5-T. 2,4,5-T is a herbicide. Its job is to kill weeds, something which it does very well. It was used to devastating effect by the Americans in Vietnam to defoliate the enemy's jungle refuge. But then came reports of an alarming increase in child abnormalities among civilians in the areas sprayed. The Americans stopped using the herbicide. But 2,4,5-T has never been able to shake its reputation as a teratogen, a substance which causes birth defects. Spina bifida, a birth defect that, if not fatal, often means partial paralysis. According to international statistics, it strikes 1 in every 1,000 births. Spina bifida is caused by the incomplete development of the neural tube. Another and more disturbing neural tube defect is anencephaly, where the baby has no brain at all. Anencephaly is always fatal. Like spina bifida, anencephaly is a 1 in 1,000 chance. Between June 1975 and May 1976, 93 children were born in the small Victorian country town of Yarram. 3 had neural tube defects, either spina bifida or anencephaly. 2 more babies were pre-viable, too premature to survive. They still don't know the cause, but while the women were pregnant, Yarram was sprayed with the heaviest concentration of herbicides in its history. One of them was 2,4,5-T, known to cause both deformities and miscarriages in animals. Tragically, the mother of one of the deformed babies, a stillborn anencephaly, had lost a previous child to Potter's syndrome, the rare disorder which Dr. Gibson's research in Adelaide suggests may sometimes be linked with pesticide exposure. That same Yarram mother subsequently produced a second Potter's baby. The odds against such an unhappy sequence are almost incalculable.
Now, I'm convinced that we would find, if we had the statistical material in front of us, that there are other areas like that in Australia, in areas where these herbicides are in use. I do know of 2 cases which I can't reveal to you any detail because I have told the doctors concerned that I won't convey the information onto anyone, but I do know of 2 other similar cases in Victoria.
At about the same time as the horror of Yarram was dawning, doctors in New Zealand were beginning to question 2 quite distinct medical phenomena with strong parallels to the Victorian case. The district hospital at Waikato is associated with about 400 confinements every month. On average, it could expect one of those babies to have a neural tube defect. Statisticians would allow for mild fluctuations, perhaps 2 or even 3 such defects one month, none the next. But that doesn't explain what began to happen at the end of 1975. December 27th, a Hamilton woman has a spina bifida baby. January 4th, an anencephaly baby is born in a neighbouring town. January 13th, a second spina bifida baby. January 14th, another spina bifida. January 16th, spina bifida. January 23rd, spina bifida. January 24th, a second anencephaly baby. January 26th, yet another spina bifida. Within just 1 month, there were 8 cases. That's 8 times the average.
It's not as simple a situation as we had with thalidomide, where thalidomide produced a very characteristic kind of defect, just one specific defect involving shortening of the limbs or absence of limbs. And you could see a whole series of those cases arising in a short period of time, and it still took 3 years for us to identify thalidomide as the cause of those defects. If you can imagine a situation where you have a wide range of defects, including perhaps things like spina bifida, anencephaly, and a few other defects of that type, plus a whole range of rather subtle biochemical disorders. Any one of these occurring at increased frequency, extra cases in other words being caused by the chemical, but when you spread out the effect over a wide range of effects, it's much harder to detect than is a single effect. And we will miss a lot of chemicals which have this kind of effect simply by looking at what happens to humans. We don't know how to look adequately at human data, human information, even if we kept records, which we don't. We don't know how to look at it to assess the significance of chemicals which have these sorts of wide-ranging effects.
So you're suggesting really that 2,4,5-T could just be a catalyst for a lot of fairly normally occurring abnormalities?
Essentially that is. That is the problem, that many of these abnormalities occur spontaneously in the population anyway. There is a tendency to assume that that's just an act of God or something of that sort. It may not be at all. It may reflect exposure to naturally occurring chemicals, which are mutagenic or teratogenic. That may be the case, in which case the extra ones are being caused by newly introduced chemicals like 2,4,5-T.
The second New Zealand case study is even more difficult to rationalise away. In 1974, 2 women in the little town of Opanaki gave birth to children with anencephaly. In 1976, 2 more women produced children with anencephaly. In a small place like Opanaki, such a high incidence of anencephaly was unusual. What made it remarkably so was that 3 of the 4 cases came from the same street, and the 4th case came from a neighbouring street only a few hundred yards away. There's no proven connection between the New Zealand cases and 2,4,5-T, but the herbicide is commonly used around Opanaki and in the Waikato district.
Do I reject the possibility? I don't think there's any evidence for human birth defects with the use of 2,4,5-T in Australia.
There's ample evidence for animal birth defects, and there are several cases where there must be a query about, such as Yarram, such as Waikato, New Zealand, such as Vietnam, where the Americans used it.
The Yarram incident is under investigation by the Victorian authorities. I wouldn't like to say anything about Vietnam. The New Zealand reports were subject to a very extensive investigation by the Department of Health in that country.
Authorities anywhere are notoriously reluctant to find evidence which may reflect on themselves. A New Zealand health official who investigated the Opanaki case, where 3 anencephaly babies were born in the one street, ruled out 2,4,5-T involvement, yet the houses were only a few hundred yards away from paddocks subject to 2,4,5-T spraying. The government of South Vietnam actually made the reported side effects of 2,4,5-T spraying there classified information. Even the Yarram story only came out by accident, when 2,4,5-T was inadvertently dropped on a prized botanical garden. In the hue and cry that followed, 2 local doctors revealed that they had already stumbled across the unusually high rate of abnormalities when casually comparing notes. One of them, Dr. Rod Guy, is now a casualty supervisor at Melbourne's Royal Children's Hospital. The hospital is so touchy about his involvement that we had to talk outside hospital grounds. That sensitivity reflects the initial response from the Victorian Health Department to the Yarram disclosures.
Well, we made a list of the abnormalities, the problems we'd had, and that was sent to the Department of Health.
And then what was their reaction?
We didn't hear any more until the present time.
So in other words, it appeared to have been shelved.
I think this is what apparently happened.
I think that there's a general consensus of opinion amongst medical people and agricultural scientists and others that there are very effective regulations in Australia controlling such matters, and when you look in detail at these, you find that's not the case. Because the way that the regulation has come into practice does not control the dioxin impurity. And this is something that concerns me, because the authorities have got the impression that dioxin is very carefully controlled, and that's one of the known dangerous impurities of 2,4,5-T.
Dioxin is the core of the 2,4,5-T controversy. Dioxin was developed during World War II as a nerve toxin. It's not part of the original formula for 2,4,5-T, but an impurity which finds its way into the chemical during manufacture. In commercial 2,4,5-T, dioxin is present in only minute quantities. The allowable level in Australia is just 1 part per 10 million. But dioxin is so incredibly toxic that even when it's that diluted, there are doubts about its safety. A recent 9-month feeding study found that a regular intake of less than 5 parts per 100,000 million was lethal for some laboratory animals. Little wonder Seveso was such a calamity. The northern Italian town had to be completely evacuated after an industrial accident released a mere 5 pounds of dioxin into the atmosphere. Entire crops were destroyed, and the authorities monitored more than 12,000 animal deaths. Strangely, the figures on human casualties are not so easily come by, but it's believed at least 80 women were aborted, 70 women had miscarriages, and 15 children were later born with deformities. Many others developed a disfiguring skin complaint called chloracne. There could hardly be a more dramatic illustration of dioxin's fearsome properties. But Seveso was not the first industrial accident involving dioxin. In the 50s and 60s, a number of 2,4,5-T factories in Europe shut down after workers at each one had developed chloracne and other ailments. It's generally assumed that the same dioxin is to blame for any harmful side effects from 2,4,5-T. But now United States authorities are pointing the finger at 2,4,5-T itself.
Well, what happened was that in the case of the Vietnam War, there was a lot of scientific debate about the birth-deforming properties of 2,4,5-T, and the people who were concerned in the studies pointed out that the 2,4,5-T used in Vietnam had high levels of dioxin, and one particular form of dioxin, 2,3,7,8-TCDD. Now, from that time on, in all the regulations to control the dioxin impurity, it was only 2,3,7,8-TCDD which they were concerned with controlling. And yet there are many other forms of dioxin which could be conceivably present, and these aren't controlled under the regulations.
Some of these other dioxin-like molecules, not the 2,3,7,8 variety, but others, have turned up in places like animal feed and so on. Now, we don't know what effect those chemicals may be having. We don't know what effects they can have, but we use the stuff in advance of finding out, which is where I think that the whole system is wrong. We should be finding these things out first, before exposing people on a widespread scale to pesticides like this.
Well, actually, I suppose the onus should be on the manufacturer to satisfy to the best of his, or on the best evidence that he can accumulate, that his product, when used in accordance with good agricultural practice, will not give rise to any ill effects.
Well, of course, it's very hard to test humans, so the general test seems to be with laboratory animals.
Yes.
2,4,5-T is known to cause teratogenic effects in laboratory animals. Why don't you take the extrapolation into humans?
I think the teratogen in 2,4,5-T has been found to be the TCDD. And Council has recommended a certain level that should not be exceeded in 2,4,5-T.
The regulation itself is one of the Australian Standards Association, and it only can control the dioxin level in the unformulated 2,4,5-T. Much of the 2,4,5-T that we use now is imported, and it's imported as a formulated product. So in Australia, we can't measure the TCDD content.
About 300 tonnes of 2,4,5-T are manufactured in Australia each year at a factory outside Perth. After our earlier experience with companies' closed-door attitudes, it came as no surprise that we were not allowed to film anywhere near the production area. However, the firm was happy to show off the laboratory where it monitors dioxin levels. Chemical Industries Kwinana is one of only 4 2,4,5-T plants still operating in the Western world. It's a private company and runs a very private operation. A few weeks ago, the US Environmental Protection Agency reported that, quote, findings of birth defects and cancerous tumours among laboratory animals exposed to 2,4,5-T indicate that it may cause the same problems among people. It's significant that the findings implicate 2,4,5-T, not just a dioxin impurity. American manufacturers have been given 60 days to refute the new evidence.
Do you think you'll be having a closer look at 2,4,5-T now?
I think so. Actually, we're sending off for clarification on the issues raised, but I certainly think we would have to have another look at it.
How do you feel personally about 2,4,5-T? Do you have any doubts now about it?
Well, I'd like to see the new evidence that has come to light before answering that.
All the evidence, both from mutation tests and as far as we can tell from actual cancers in human beings, is that with substances which are carcinogenic or substances which are capable of causing mutation, there is a linear relationship between the dose to which a person or a bacterium is exposed and the effects. Now, what this means is that any dose is dangerous, and the amount of damage decreases to zero only at zero dose.
Are you concerned with the suggested link between 2,4,5-T and human birth defects?
I'm interested in it, but it's not a commercial problem.
What do you mean it's not a commercial problem?
It's because it's not possible for a person using commercial 2,4,5-T containing these minute infinitesimal quantities of dioxin to be poisoned by them.
How do you know that?
The toxicity becomes meaningless in the dilution. I'll give you an example, if you wouldn't mind, that I've calculated here, and this has been confirmed by well, it's a matter of mathematics, and the toxicity of tetrachlorodibenzodioxin is well known. It's acknowledged. Now, according to the normal toxicity ratings and acknowledged toxicity ratings, no scientists argue about these ones. You'll have to take my word for that. But if a woman ate 3.3 pounds a day of food at the maximum Australian limits, that is 0.1 parts per million, excuse me, of TCDD, for 100 years, she would get 1/60,000th of the amount necessary to cause her fetal problems when she gave birth to her baby.
What is the amount necessary to cause fetal problems?
On the I've got figures here. It's per kilo. It's somewhere between 1 microgram and 0.5 micrograms per kilo.
How do they know that?
Well, this is translated from. This is taking the worst case, because
the worst case, I mean, it has happened.
Not has happened. It's never happened. There's never been a toxic problem with commercial 2,4,5-T.
There are at least 10 chemical herbicides and pesticides in general, which are banned or severely restricted in the US, yet are exported to this country and are freely available here. Do you see any dilemma there?
We would certainly like to know which ones these are.
Well, I'm sure you would. They're quite commonly used chemicals in some cases, often used for household spraying, aldrin, chlordane, that sort of thing. 2,4,5-T, 2,4-D.
Yes. Well, certainly we keep ourselves informed of what's going on.
What have you been using, mate? Forgets, Phycam, Diazin.
Such chemicals are not only freely available in Australia, but there's also very little control over how they're used. However, we do try to pick up any harmful effects afterwards. In New South Wales, the Health Department conducts compulsory blood tests on pest control operators and other regular users, such as greenkeepers, as well as providing a voluntary service for farmers.
See you next time.
Okay, bye-bye.
Graham, is it normal when you're doing these sort of tests to find that a number of people have been adversely affected by the toxic substances they're handling?
Oh, we do get them. Their numbers aren't necessarily that great in absolute terms, or even for that matter in percentages. But they do occur, certainly.
And what happens then? What do you do with them?
What happens is there are basically two classes of pesticides, and out of those two classes, they'll go off one if they're adversely affected with that and go on to the other class of pesticide.
Is that an equally hazardous pesticide you're talking about?
Well, they've both got their hazards. If they are poisoned, or they could be showing a various number of symptoms. If they're organophosphates, then they'll have nausea, lethargy, double vision, this sort of thing, as it starts off, which could lead to a very serious coma and ultimately death if it was that extreme. That isn't common. The other type would be the organochlorines, which tend to show shaking, this sort of thing, nervousness, twitching of the eyes, this sort of thing, which again could be very serious.
Earlier this year, tests were performed on 12 pesticide officers employed by a weeds control authority in New South Wales. 10 had to be taken off the job because they'd had excessive exposure to herbicides, one of them 2,4,5-T.
Well, I have a great amount of concern about the way the herbicide is used in agriculture and in forestry. For example, one of the things which happens in Australia, which is very strongly controlled in many overseas countries, is these herbicides are sprayed from the air. Countries like Sweden and America a long time ago abandoned practices such as that. This is a very non-specific way of applying a herbicide. It's a way that it can get to non-target areas very, very easily.
The New South Wales government was sufficiently concerned about the problem of pesticide drift to introduce an Aerial Spraying Control Act. That was back in 1969. 9 years later, the legislation still hasn't been implemented. It's not that the problem has gone away. In fact, the reverse is true.
We found that the levels we had in our soil and pasture of DDT were such that it would only be a matter of time before we'd face a situation of quarantine, and we just couldn't suffer the financial difficulties associated with that.
John Story is a councillor of the Livestock and Grain Producers Association. 6 months ago, DDT contamination of his pasture forced him out of cattle. Some graziers bring such troubles on themselves, but in the 15 years he raised cattle in the Namoi Valley, John Story says he never once used DDT. The Namoi Valley is the state's major cotton growing area. Cotton producers the world over are plagued by a worm pest, and when it appeared in the Namoi, the farmers began spraying DDT. The pest began to develop immunity, the farmers increased the dosage of DDT, the pest became still more resistant, and so on, until the cottonworm's resistance had increased more than 200-fold. At the height of the spraying in 1973, 24 farmers were hospitalised, and another 30 of those who volunteered for blood tests had to be removed from further exposure.
Nearly every person was showing a bad result, so much so that we were a bit worried about our own tests. We had to do our own blood, and we found that our blood was okay and that most people were adversely affected.
Obviously, the cotton farmers were fighting a costly losing battle. And what was happening to the environment while all this was going on? A biologist who studied the region from 1972 to 1976 found that the level of DDT in the Namoi River, where it flows through the cotton belt, was up to 100 times higher than it was immediately upstream. Fish had developed resistance to the poison and, like the bird life, contained DDT levels among the highest in the world. The local kookaburras and kestrels began laying eggs with shells 20% thinner than usual. The use of DDT in the Namoi has dropped considerably, but the problem remains. The chemical is extremely persistent, like some of the farmers who use it. Last year, they poured another 270 tonnes of DDT into the valley. Even when the accumulated DDT started to contaminate livestock, the New South Wales government failed to take positive steps to stop indiscriminate use of the pesticide. Instead, it quarantined the cattle. The seriousness of the situation must have dawned on the authorities when they tested this herd.
We haven't used DDT on this property where these cattle have been running at any time. The Pollution Control Commission came and tested some of these, and up to 76 parts per million DDT in some of these cows.
And what's the allowable limit? What, 5?
The allowable limit is 5, and anything over 5, the cattle are quarantined on the property. What are we going to do about it?
But these cattle have not been quarantined. Such action is only taken if excessive residues are picked up by random testing in abattoirs. The offending beast is then traced back to the farm, where further fat samples are taken. In the past 12 months, 13 herds have been quarantined in the Namoi. There's little doubt that a lot more would be quarantined if there was blanket testing.
We take samples from abattoirs around the state. Most abattoirs are currently on 10 per week. Abattoirs kill about 1,500 cattle a week on the average, I suppose, so our sampling level's fairly low.
So can we assume that, logically from that a lot of cattle are probably getting through, that you're not testing, they probably have high residue levels?
Yes, well, we must be letting cattle through at this level. At Narrabri sale yards clears about 3,000 cattle a week throughout the year. These are mainly killed in northern and north coastal abattoirs, and we're only sampling 10 a week from each of these abattoirs.
Sometimes, when a beast is traced back to a farm, it's only to find that the rest of the herd has already gone through the abattoir, past the very same inspectors. The Department of Agriculture is understandably sensitive about the Namoi and would prefer to talk about a new Pesticides Act soon to be introduced in New South Wales. The Registrar of Pesticides is currently touring the state, warning the natives that tougher times are ahead.
We've brought in what's been cited as a pretty stringent new piece of legislation to control these materials. We're determined that we're going to do that. There are quite severe penalties for people who misuse materials. For example, fines of $2,000 for a corporation, $500 for an individual for not reading a label or following the instructions on a label.
Other states are expected to blueprint the New South Wales legislation. But how will it be policed? A team of about 15 inspectors will be expected to cover the entire state.
Is it likely, you think, that any of the pesticides currently available in Australia will be withdrawn completely?
We are already pledged to phasing out chemicals of the DDT type over a period of years. So I think you can say that one day you will see the end of those pesticides when we have satisfactory alternative materials to replace them.
That's a very vague, open-ended commitment, though. Is there anything, now that you're going to have this power, is there anything that is likely to be withdrawn straight away?
Immediately. Now, the answer to that is no, or quite frankly, we would have already taken action against them.
The powers of the new legislation will not extend to the activities of other government departments, which seems a pity if the New South Wales Forestry Commission's cavalier approach to 2,4,5-T is any guide. In 1975, the World Health Organization spelled out a careful protocol for 2,4,5-T users. On disposal of containers, it had this to say.
If not decontaminated, container must either be burned or crushed and buried below topsoil. Care must be taken to avoid subsequent contamination of water sources. Decontaminated containers should not be used for food and drink.
The New South Wales Forestry Commission tenders rather different advice.
No damage to stock or other fauna should result if an empty spray tank is washed out into a running stream. And humans could drink with safety water from a tanker which had previously contained spray solution, provided that it had been flushed through with clean water.
Now, the Victorian Forestry Commission spray a lot of 2,4,5-T. They use it on pine plantations to eliminate wattles and eucalypts and broadleaf plants because it's a selective herbicide and doesn't affect the pines. Now, the Forestry Commission at one stage was concerned to find how much 2,4,5-T got into stream water, and in 1973 they carried out a 7-day study where they sprayed a pine plantation and they measured the 2,4,5-T level in the stream water as it drained from that area. Now, remember, the standard is 20 parts per billion for 2,4,5-T in water. They measured levels of up to 700 parts per billion in the stream water, and yet they did nothing about it.
Go ahead, Fred. Go.
Every year, the National Health and Medical Research Council tests food across Australia for possible contamination by pesticides and other noxious substances. It's called the Market Basket Survey. The latest report suggests that there's nothing particularly alarming in what we're eating. What is alarming is that this latest report is for the year 1975. The 1976 survey is still being processed, and the results are not due out for another month or so yet. In other words, we have to wait 2 years to find out that we may well have been eating contaminated food all along. It's clear that some toxic substances must find their way into our daily bread. How much of that is reaching the meal table is another matter. The Commonwealth Department of Primary Industries tests more than 2,000 food samples a month for pesticide residues. About 6 of those samples, on average, are found to have unacceptable levels. The federal monitoring is backed up independently by the states. The New South Wales food testing laboratories at Lidcombe, for example, analyse close to another 1,000 samples a year. But obviously the bulk of our food intake cannot be tested. We know from the Namoy example that some food, perhaps a great deal, is getting through with unacceptable residues of pesticide. We don't know for certain what might be the cumulative effect of consuming acceptable levels. But what alternatives do we have?
In the bad old days, where the aeroplanes blanketing the countryside with broad-spectrum insecticides, all sorts of problems arose. Nowadays, we like to think of pest control as manipulating nature in a variety of ways. In this case, by the use of the selection of animals resistant to cattle tick, pasture spelling, the use of parasites and so on. And we believe that the future of pest control is really going to lie in this direction.
As head of the CSIRO's entomology section, Doug Waterhouse has been pushing biological alternatives for many years. There have been some marked successes, but biologists don't pretend to have all the answers.
A lot more work needs to be done to have effective use of all of the biological controls at our disposal. And it's more complicated, therefore, than the rather simpler technology of application of the pesticides.
Yes, why do you think there is a reluctance to fully explore the possibilities?
I think this was because of the dramatic effects during the war, the use of DDT and BHC. And just after the war, these and other synthetic organic pesticides became available. In fact, it was said by some of my colleagues that we'd all be out of a job before very long, but this, of course, hasn't happened. Biologists first, and then the public at large became aware of some of the disadvantages of the use of pesticides.
We can't undo the effects of the last 20 or 30 years of exposure to massive numbers of chemicals. Most of them were introduced into the market before we knew how to even look for mutagenic effects or carcinogenic effects of chemicals. We didn't do it because we didn't understand that these problems existed. We thought that chemicals were innocuous in these respects until really quite recently.
There has in fact been an increase in cancer in heavily industrialised countries. In the United States, there's been a 10% increase in the age-adjusted cancer rate between 1930 and 1970. Now this in fact relates to exposure to agents in the years between 1910 and 1950. So a 10% increase in those years at a time when there was much less chemical-free in the environment. That 10% increase, furthermore, if it's broken up into its various years, looks as though it's actually increasing more steeply just recently. For instance, there was a 1% increase between 1974 and 1975. So I think we're just beginning to see an explosion of cancer in industrialised countries related to the fact that we have freed into the environment large numbers of chemicals which are capable of causing mutations, which 20 years later will result in an increase in the number of cancers.
It could take some time before we were even aware that it was happening. Cancer is not a registrable disease in Australia, so any trend is difficult to monitor. Tracing the cause is even more difficult. We also lack a central registry of birth defects.
The impression is that although the birth rate is down, we are still seeing at least as many, if not more, abnormal children than we were before.
Melbourne's Mercy Maternity Hospital recently surveyed more than 10,000 consecutive births for abnormalities. 1 in 10 babies had defects. The rate of major defects was 3 times the previously accepted figure for metropolitan hospitals. It could be simply that no one's looked closely before. It could be sheer coincidence that the use of pesticides and like chemicals has also risen dramatically.
They're very useful chemicals in lots of ways, but we have to try and assess whether the risks, properly judged risks, are worth it. And at the moment we don't know how to assess the real level of risk. We make all sorts of stabs. People have been making stabs at assessing how much of a risk there is, but very often their assessments have been based on false premises.
For those agents for which we have no alternative and which we really want to use, well, then we have to do some sort of a rather complicated cost-benefit analysis. We have to weigh up the costs in terms of human lives with the benefits, perhaps also in terms of human lives and also in dollars. Now, this is perhaps a difficult sort of concept to get across, but it is in fact exactly what we do all the time de facto. If we want electricity, which we're now using, we know that in using electricity, people will get killed in coal mines. So each kilowatt of electricity costs so many lives in terms of mining accidents.
It's a difficult equation to sit down and confront, though, isn't it?
But this I think, is the equation that really, although we haven't faced it in quite these terms in the past, this is the way we must look at it.
Does the good that these pesticides might do outweigh the fact that they may cause cancer? Should highly effective chemicals like 2,4,5-T continue to be used when there's even the slightest chance that children will be deformed? Are the preliminary warnings sounded by Dr. Gibson's rats sufficient grounds to suspend use of a pesticide with wide domestic application? It's a frightening new dimension to cost-benefit analysis, all the more so when the people making the decisions may be aware of the benefits, but not the cost.
And who indeed will weigh the balance? Andrew Olley reporting. Part of the final balance at issue in that report is the question of any possible link with cancer. Next week we'll bring you a report on the disease mankind has come to fear above all others, and the progress medical science is making against cancer. And, as well, our report on conveyancing, held over from this week. So, until next week, from Four Corners, good night.